So the work I'm going to present today is actually mostly done by my PhD student at Monash University, where I was just before joining Oxford. So Gadi Alame, she's a student, and that's her work. So we were interested here in developing structure properties relationships for hydrogels. And here we focus in particular on this near ideal hydrogel that I will present. So I suppose you know what hydrogels are. I'm trying to change my slide. Yeah, okay. So, so this is the classical cartoon you will see when we talk about hydrogels, and I'm sure you have seen this before. So they are polymer networks swollen by a large amount of water, and you have polymer chains that are linked together by these cross-linking points, which prevents the network from dissolving into water. And they are used for a broad range of applications, for example, contact lenses and wound dressing, but they're also being developed for tissue engineering or drug delivery, microfluidics, a broad range of applications. And in all these applications, of course, the mechanical properties are important. And these mechanical properties intrinsically depend on the architecture of the underlying polymer network. And there is this important question of what is the exact relationship between the network architecture and the mechanical properties. And this has been a long-standing question in polymer physics for a very long time. Now, the challenge here is because precisely the cartoon that I showed before is not exactly the reality. If you want a more realistic picture of a hydrogel network, this might be maybe something a bit closer to it. So a polymer network in a gel is a much more messier structure involving potentially a lot of inhomogeneities, for example, a region of the network which have a more denser densities of crosslinks, or you can also have topological defects. For example, you can have chains that are dangling and do not contribute to the elasticity of the network. You might find what is called loops. So these loops, for example, this is a first degree loop where you can go along the same chain and go back to the same crosslink. This is another type of defect in the sense that this chain will not contribute to the elasticity. You also have second degrees loop, where here you need two chains basically to go back and forth between two crosslinks, and you can have high degrees loop as well. And you also find entanglement. So all these sort of features in the network complicate the analysis when it comes to understanding the relationship between architecture and properties. And these challenges, they come on the side of experiments, because it's quite difficult to precisely quantify and measure these defects in the real system. And it's also a challenge on the modeling point of view, because these defects or these features, they arise at a length scale that is usually inaccessible with atomistic techniques or molecular dynamics simulation, for example. And from a continuum modeling viewpoint, these are also features that are usually not included in continuum mechanics descriptions. And this is where this ideal network come into the picture. So these refer to a specific class of hydrogels that were introduced more than 10 years ago now by a group of researchers in Japan, led by Professor Sakai. And the idea is to make hydrogels by assembling well-defined macromolecules in solution with the goal of making almost perfect network architecture. So here we talk about this PEG molecule, PEG gels. So you take two 4-armed macromolecules with a well-defined length of each arm. And the idea is to have these two types of macromolecules, and each are characterized by a different functional end group at the end of the chain, so that when you mix them up in solution in stoichiometric proportion, you will have all the A-type macromolecule reacting with the B-type. And that will prevent the formation of first degree loop and potentially lead to an almost perfect network architecture. And it's been shown that this macromolecule behave essentially as incompressible sphere in solution, and they really react to form this tetrahedra-like structure. So they can't form first degrees loop. They have a high conversion degree, so a lot of the chains actually react with each other, and it's been shown that they don't really have any entanglements. And they also have quite good mechanical properties. So this is an attractive model system to revisit this question of structure properties relationship in hydrogels, because you eliminate a lot of defects and you can work with maybe a bit more controlled and well-characterized network structure to start with. So even though they are thought to be almost perfect, they're not really perfect. There are still some defects in these gels. So one of the defects would be the fact that not all the arms react. So you have some proportion of the arms that are dangling and do not contribute to the elasticity. And there is this P parameter that describes the reaction efficiency or the proportion of the arms that are actually reacted. So when P is 1, you have a fully converted network or fully reacted structure. Now, the good news here is that even in the experiment, it's actually possible to tune the value of this conversion parameter. So researchers have found a way to, on purpose, to deactivate some of the end groups to introduce some dangling ends in a more or less controlled way, or at least you can measure it a posteriori. So you have a range of systems with p-value ranging from above 90% down to maybe 60% or something like that. So you have this range of p-values available to us as a basis to study the effect of conversion degree. So that's one type of defect, let's say. And the second type is the presence of second-degree loops. So in the case of these 4-arm PEG hydrogels, this second-degree loop arises when you have 2 arms from one macromolecule reacting with 2 arms of another macromolecule. So they are elastically effective, but you can imagine that maybe this is not the best way to improve the elasticity of your system. You can also have triple links, which are still a sort of second-degree loops, but here you have 3 arms of one macromolecule reacting with the 3 arms of another macromolecules. So this again and other loops are a bit trickier to quantify in experiment, but there have been some work trying to measure them, and the finding is that usually the loop fraction decreases when the concentration increases. So this is showing the concentration, and this here they have the loop fraction, and the red and the blue represents all these topological defects, and they decrease when the concentration increases. So in this work, we would like to propose a modeling approach that can capture to some extent the effect of these dangling ends and second-degree loops, and look at the effect on the elasticity of these near-ideal hydrogels. And we want to do it using micromechanical approach, in the sense that we want to start from individual chains as building blocks and assemble them in a meaningful way to get to the level of the whole network, accounting explicitly for the presence of these 2 types of defects. So the building block fundamentally is a single chain, and here we just rely on well-known results from rubber elasticity theory. So we consider each chain to be represented by an entropic spring, a nonlinear spring, using the freely jointed chain model. So that means that we view each chain as a collection of segments of Kuhn length, and there's n of them. And the force extension relationship is derived from classical statistical mechanics treatment, giving this linear relationship at small stretches in the Gaussian regime. And then as you extend the end-to-end distance of your chain and you approach the contour length, then the force tends to infinity, and this is described by the inverse Langevin function. So we use that as a starting point to describe the force extension relationship for each chain. And moving on with the network itself, then if you look into the literature on rubber elasticity theories, most of the models out there, they revolve around the idea of considering some statistical sampling of the chain orientation and trying to localize the macroscopic deformation onto each chain using some sort of representative unit cell. And famous examples that are being widely used are, for example, the 3-chain model, where you would have only 3 representative chains aligned with each of the principal directions and deforming with the macroscopic deformation gradient. And you have variation around this theme. So 4-chain models, or the very popular 8-chain model are with the boys, and all the collection of full network of microsphere type of model where you actually represent a whole distribution of chain in all the direction, and each chain is assumed to deform affinely with the macroscopic deformation gradient. So once you have your model to localize the stretches in each chain, then you can calculate the macroscopic free energy of your network by summing up the free energy of each individual chain, and you can derive the force extension relationship for the whole network. So now the main limitation of this approach for our purpose here is, of course, that it's not possible, or at least it's not obvious, how you would account for the presence of topological defects with such unit cells representations. So here we just built on this and consider the next step. The next step is simply to take the same sort of idea, but instead actually represent explicitly a bunch of chain in a box, and deform the box using the macroscopic deformation gradient, calculate how all the chain in the box deform, and get the macroscopic force stress strain response. So this is exactly what we did. So we started by generating isotropic random networks. So we're starting with fully reacted or perfect networks with a coordination of 4 at each node. So we created this perfect network structure, making sure it's statistically representative, it's isotropic. And then in a second stage, we introduce the defects we are interested in, which is cutting some of the springs to represent the fact that we have some dangling chains in the system. And we also introduce second degree loops. So for this, what we did is starting from the perfect network, we identified 2 adjacent links, and we basically swap around the junction so that we create these double links while keeping the coordination of each node the same. So we can create all this range of structure with controlling the amount of dangling chains and the presence of loop. We apply the external loading in the form of affine boundary condition on the external nodes in the system, and then we calculate the position of the internal nodes from energy minimization, and this is done using lamps. So for each spring, we use this fully jointed chain or inverse Langevin expression. And finally, when we have equilibrated the system, we can calculate the macroscopic stress from the reaction forces on the external nodes. So that's the general tool we are using. And once we have our stress strain curve, we can calculate things like the modulus or the limit extensibility. And our goal is, of course, to investigate how this architecture of the network will impact the mechanical properties. So the parameters we are looking at and that we can vary independently and systematically is the density of elastically effective chains, so nu, which is the number of chain divided by the volume of the box. Now this number of chain is a simulation parameter. This is a big number, so that we have a RVE. So this is not changed basically. So we adjust the density of chain by changing the size of the box. That's how we control the density of chains. Second parameter we have is the average crosslink coordination Z. So this is the average number of chain that meet at each crosslinking point, which is controlled primarily by playing with this probability of making a crosslink or not. We have almost a one-to-one correlation between coordination and reaction efficiency here, slightly impacted by the loop fraction. And the loop fraction is the third one, so we can control the fraction of the chains that participates to a double link or triple link. And we vary each one of them independently. The first thing we look at is the elastic modulus. So we get all these curves. So for example, the elastic modulus as a function of density. This is for 3 average coordination. So you have modulus increasing with density, but note the power here, power 1/3. And in general also the modulus increases with coordination. We also have the evolution of modulus with coordination, but for different loop fractions at a constant density. So what it shows here is really that for fixed coordination and fixed density, the loop fraction does have a big impact on the elastic modulus. So the more loops you have in the system, the lower the modulus. Now we wanted to develop some sort of scaling relations, because this is what people like to see in this sort of studies. So we could come up with a relatively neat scaling relationship here. So the modulus scale with this density to the power of 1/3, inversely proportional to n, number of Kuhn segments. And this is the dependency on coordination, where ZC is the coordination at the percolation threshold, which is a function of the loop fraction. So you can see that the effect of loop fraction is lumped into this critical coordination value, and when we do that, all curves collapse onto a single master expression. So going a bit beyond that, the question is, why does it arise? What's the origin for this scaling, in particular this one, which might trouble you if you're familiar with rubber elasticity theory, and you would maybe expect that it would be proportional to density and not the power of 1/3. So to understand where this is coming from, we have to consider an exact expression for the elastic modulus of a network of Gaussian chains. So this expression here is exact. So what it's, just follows from the Gaussian behavior of the chain, and the fact that in that case, it's the case that each chain deform affinely with the macroscopic deformation gradient. In that case, you can show relatively easily that the modulus is given by KT nu times this extra factor here that is often forgotten, which is the ratio of the end-to-end distance, or average end-to-end distance of the chain in the network squared divided by this NB squared. So in the case where all the chain in the network on average take their random walk end-to-end distance, when R bar is equal to square root NB, as it is often assumed, then this factor is equal to unity, and you recover your familiar result that G is equal to KT nu, the affine modulus estimate. Now the thing is that in our network, we cannot enforce a priori that the chain will take the random walk estimates as the end-to-end distance in the network. Actually, the end-to-end distance of the chains in the network in the initial configuration depends on the architecture and depends on the density. So this ratio is in general not 1 and represents the pre-stretching of the chain. So the average pre-stretch of the chains even before you start deforming the network. And this end-to-end distance, you can actually estimate it from relatively straightforward geometric arguments in terms of coordination and density. And so we have verified that, well, we can come up with the fact that, for example, the end-to-end distance cube is inversely proportional to density, just from the fact that if you have more chain in the network, the chain are on average more pre-compressed. This sort of argument, which then gives you the expected scaling for the end-to-end distance of the pre-stretch, and when you include that into the exact expression here, you recover the scaling for the modulus. So all this lengthy discussion to highlight the fact that in these networks, which are formed by assembling well-defined molecule in solution, we don't think that an affine estimate is necessarily appropriate. We think that the pre-stretch is important and needs to be taken into account if you want to capture the effect of topology on the modulus. Now moving on to another parameter of interest, which is the limit extensibility of the network, which is the macroscopic stretch that you reach when the stress tends to infinity. We can get that from the stress strain curve, or we can also get that from another estimate we propose, which is just identifying the shortest path from one side of the RV to the other, identifying this shortest path and calculating this maximum extensibility by the number of chain in the shortest path times the contour length divided by the box length. So this is another estimate that does not require any equilibrium consideration, it's just purely geometric. So we have this measure that we can use, and a simple estimate without any calculation to it would be to say that the maximum extensibility of the network is reached when a representative chain reaches the contour length, which is something that is widely used. So for example, that would be the simple estimate we can make, with the caveat that this would be the initial end-to-end distance of the chain in the undeformed network, which in our case depends on the pre-stretch. And so if we substitute for R the expression for the pre-stretch from the previous slide, we end up with this scaling relation that gives us the maximum extensibility as a function of all the network parameters. And if we try to see how good this estimate is, so here we have the extensibility as a function of density for different coordination, and the dashed line is the simple estimate, so it works decently well. We have again a scaling of extensibility with density with a power of 1/3, which is again a direct consequence of the pre-stretch. So the more pre-compressed the chains are, then the larger the extensibility, because they just have more freedom to deform than if they are more pre-stretched in the first place. We also looked at the effect of loop fraction on the extensibility. Here it's a bit more complicated, so this simple estimate doesn't work that well to predict the effect of loop fraction on the extensibility limit. We don't know exactly why and how we could fix that. We suspect that, well, the loop fraction have an impact on the shortest path by changing the topology of the network, but we couldn't really come up with a simple expression to describe this effect. But basically, the major trends in terms of coordination is quite well reproduced. Okay, so we have done this, this study with some scaling relationship linking the properties to the network parameters. Another thing we can do with this discrete networks tool is to compare discrete networks predictions to prediction from classical continuum theories, just as a way to directly probe how well this simplified RVE work in comparison to a full random network. So we did that for the 3-chain model, the 8-chain model, the full network model, compare them to discrete network simulation for different loading conditions. So this is the result for uniaxial tension, for example, where you can see that the full network estimate is kind of spot on, but the 8-chain model is underestimating the response, and the 3-chain model is too stiff. And we have similar prediction for the shear response. In biaxial, it's a bit more in between the 3-chain and the full network, but the 8-chain is always too soft. Note that to make meaningful comparisons between the discrete network model and the continuum estimates, of course, it only makes sense if you use the same pre-stretch in the first place, because all these theories, they usually assume that the end-to-end distance of the chain or the pre-stretch is that you would find is if all the chain would take the random walk estimates in the undeformed network. So here we just made sure that we use the same pre-stretch in all the models so that we have the correct slope to start with. So what it shows is basically the full network is perfectly fine. Well, it could be slightly improved maybe in biaxial case, but it's quite minor. And the 8-chain model is a bit too soft. To try to understand why or it doesn't work or what can be improved in here, we can look at chain length distribution in the network. For example, here we have the distribution of the initial end-to-end distance of the chain in the network. So in the initial configuration, so the black line is the almost Gaussian distribution of the chain end-to-end distances initially, whereas the red is the single value, because all these models all assume that all the chains have the same initial end-to-end distance to start with, whereas the random network would predict a distribution initially. And then as you deform the network and you look at different macroscopic stretches, so 3, 5, 7, and you look at how this distribution is evolving during deformation, you can see the vertical lines corresponding to the 3-chain and the 8-chain, because these have only a discrete amount of chains. So the 3-chain would have only 2 different deformation for for the 3 chains, and the A chain would have only 1 stretches, because all the chains see the same stretch, which is the stretch, the red line. And the full network does predict some distribution, which is the black curve here, and the blue is the discrete network representation. So you can see how the full network kind of predict quite well the distribution of end-to-end distances during deformation with this flattening of the curve. And in the biaxial case, which is the case where the full network model is not that accurate, we can see that the origin is that it actually misses some of the highly extended chains. So the full network doesn't capture some of the highly extended chain you see in the random model. Now, one of the directions for improving continuum theories for rubber elasticity is to try to remove this assumption of affine deformations of the chains, which is often used. So we wanted to see if deviation from affinity was a thing, at least in our random networks, because although at small deformation, you can demonstrate that all the chains should deform affinely, when in the regime where they are, when the force extension relationship is linear. But when you go to high stretches and the force extension relationship becomes non-linear, you're not sure that you will still have affine deformation of all the chains. So what we did here is compare the chain length distribution during deformation and comparing the actual distributions when we solve the equilibrium equations to the distribution we would get if we just apply the affine stretch to all the chain, and see how that differs from the actual calculation. And the answer is that it doesn't change too much, which just means that roughly all the chains continue to deform roughly affinely up to large stretches. And we also calculated some indicators like the average deviation between affinity, and we did that for different defects concentrations, for different coordination values and different loop fraction, and we always get a deviation from affinity which is very small, like few percent. So at this stage we cannot really conclude that we see a lot of deviation from affinity in our network, at least. So now for the last part of the talk, I just want to move on to actually comparing this random network predictions to actual experimental data, because luckily we have a lot of this data for this tetrapeg hydrogel in the literature. So here the challenge is to first identify the input parameters from the experimental preparation conditions. So what we know, what is reported in the literature when they do experiments, is the volume fraction of the pre-polymer, this phi naught. That's often available. You also know the molecular weights of this 4-armed macromolecule. And from this molecular weight, you can work out the number of monomers you will have along each arm, and then also in the network, because 2 arms of the tetra molecule form 1 chain in the network. So we can get the number of monomers, and we can also estimate the contour length of each chain in the network. So the contour length corresponding to 2 arms of the original pre-polymer. So we have all this data. A first difficulty we have come across is that there's actually indications that suggest that peg chains in water and in solution do not behave as ideal chains, because for an ideal chain, you would expect that if you have a free chain that behaves ideally, the end-to-end distance of that chain should not depend on concentration and has this scaling with n to the power of 1/2. But here you have reports showing the evolution of the gyration radius of these 4 arms macromolecule when they do not react. So there's no network forming. You just have solutions of 4-arm macromolecule at different concentration and for different molecular weight, showing that the gyration radius changes with volume fraction and decreases, which suggests that as you put more and more of these 4 arms pre-polymers in solution, they will just behave like impenetrable sphere and contract, which is believed to be due to the interactions between the N group. So you have a relationship between the radius of these polymers and the concentration. And also the scaling with the molecular weight is also not consistent with the one from an ideal chain. So this suggests that maybe using an ideal chain model as it is initially is maybe not realistic. So what we did here is propose a simple model for non-ideal chains that somehow reproduce these experimental trends for the gyration radius. So we started by taking a model proposed by Paryukov, which was proposed for investigating the effect of preparation conditions on swelling, and we adapted it to our purpose. So this model is for small deformations only. So it's also a linear relationship between the end-to-end distance and the force, but the difference is that now you have a reference end-to-end length that appears in the elastic constant, and this distance is a function of concentration and number of monomers. So I won't go into the detail, but we have used this expression for the reference length, which kind of capture this experimental trends for unreacted chains. Now, because this is only valid for the small deformation regime, we have also extended that to the large deformation regime by still adopting the inverse Langevin expression, but just as an extrapolation purpose. So what we do is we adjust the parameters in the inverse Langevin function such that at small forces you recover the linear relationship here, but at large forces you reach the right contour length. So this N and B parameter here, they're not the Kuhn length, they're not the number of Kuhn segments, they are just fitting parameter to reach the right contour length at large deformations. So this is our very crude and naive approach to account for non-ideality, but this is our starting point anyway. For the network next, so we need to, of course, adjust the amount of defects in the network to reproduce the experimental trends. So regarding the density, what we did is, starting from the preparation volume fraction, we can estimate the density of chains that we would have if all the chains were reacting. And that allows us to set the box size. And once this is fixed, then we can introduce a defect, keeping the box length constant. The reaction efficiency P is taken directly from experiments because this is often reported. The only unknown parameter is the loop fraction. So this one is rarely measured or estimated, so we don't know. So, and this is the only fitting parameter we have in our models. What we did is an inverse approach. We take experimental data, fit the loop fraction to get the best prediction, and then gather all the loop fraction we obtain from a broad range of experimental data and look whether there is a consistent trend for the loop fraction obtained from different sets of experimental data. So an example is, for example, here you have stress strain curves for tetrapec gel with this molecular weight and this volume fraction. And these are stress strain curves for different P values, so different reaction efficiency. So the P values here are the experimentally reported values. And the dashed line is the fit with the random network model. And each dashed line was obtained by fitting the loop fraction. And we had to adjust the loop fraction with the P value to get a good fit. So it was not possible to fit all these curves with a single value of the loop fraction. And here we had to actually decrease the loop fraction as the P value decreases. So other data we can use, here you have experimental reports of the modulus as a function of the reaction efficiency for gels with different volume fractions. So you see that the modulus increases with the p-value, as also shown with the simulations, and also increases with the concentration. So this is the experimental data. And we fitted the loop fraction in the random network models to reproduce this modulus. And these are the fitted loop fractions that we obtain. We see that the loop fraction should increase with the reaction efficiency, which is consistent with the previous plot, and also that the loop fraction should decrease when the concentration increases. So this is an example of the kind of backfitting approach we adopted. But we did that for basically all the data we found in the literature. We tried the same approach, and we collected all these points on master curve to see if some common trend emerged, and that's the case. So for example, here you have the fitted loop fraction as a function of reaction efficiency, and here it's normalized by the loop fraction at full conversion to the value when p is 1. And you have that for different reports, and they all nicely collapse onto a single master curve. The effect of volume fraction of pre-polymers and molecular weight is captured via this zeta naught parameter, which is here as a function of volume fraction, and the effect of molecular weight is hidden inside this overlap concentration here. And here the fit is not as perfect. They don't really collapse perfectly onto a single curve, but the trend is very well reproduced across many reports. An interesting bit here is the stars here. The stars are not fit or of any sort. The stars are actually direct experimental measurements of loop fractions. So, and so this is the only, well, direct measurement we have, but the good news is that they also agree with the value of the loop fraction we obtain by fitting, which is an indication that it's not too bad. And the main thing being that the loop fraction decreases when concentration increases. So once we have these master curves that predict the amount of loop as a function of the preparation conditions, then we can start to do predictions, where in this case there are absolutely no fitting whatsoever. So we took another set of experimental data for stress strain curves up to large deformations and just run the model, see what happens. So this is for different volume fractions, 2 different molecular weights, and there's a given p-value that's not written here. So overall, it's not too bad. I mean, we capture the stress level, we capture the effect of volume fraction, although the effect is stronger in the experiment. So there is some effect of volume fraction on the stiffening at large deformation that we don't fully capture yet. But overall, it's encouraging. We looked also at the maximum extensibility. So there are not so many reports out there that report the extensibility of gels, which is probably linked to the fact that it's quite difficult experimentally to stretch these very soft materials up to very large deformation. But at least for one report we found that reported the maximum extensibility as a function of volume fraction and molecular weight. The experimental scaling relation was that it scales with the number of Kuhn segment or the molecular weight with power of 2/3 and scales with volume fraction of pre-polymers with power of 1/3. And this is the same scaling that we find with the model as well, although the model overestimates the extensibility limits. And here the point I really want to reiterate is that this scaling we find in the experiment and in the model is not the same scaling you would get from classical rubber elasticity theory, because in the classical models, you would find a square root n here and no dependence on volume fraction or density whatsoever. But these different exponents, they are, at least in the model, they are directly related to this pre-stretch effect again. The fact that depending on molecular weight, depending on density, you have chains that are more or less pre-stretched initially, and that has a big impact on the maximum extensibility you can reach. So that's the end of my talk. Basically, as a summary, we have implemented this random discrete network as a computational tool to look systematically at the effect of various network parameters on the mechanical properties. And the main thing is looking at the effect of reaction efficiency and loops, which has not been so much investigated before. And there is indeed a big impact of loop fraction on the mechanical properties. The main argument to explain, to rationalize these effects is via the pre-stretch. So we think this is an important parameter. to take into account possibly also in continuum models. And there was also the non-ideality of the chain that is likely to be important in the case of these tetrapeg hydrogels. Now, of course, this sort of computational tool could be extended to include other effects that we haven't implemented yet, but we can easily extend it to account for chain scission by incorporating a failure criterion or energy criterion in the force extension to relationship to account for chain breaking. I think it would be possible to also describe crosslink breaking and reforming. Of course, we can easily describe polydispersity in the computational model, and it might be possible also to look at interpenetrating networks. And these are all left for future works. And I want to finish by an advertisement for the wonderful EMMC conference that will take place next year, hopefully in person in Oxford in April 2022. And I really hope to see you all there in the great city of Oxford next year. Thank you very much.